Hey guys, my name is Rob, and today we're actually doing something a little bit different. About 2 months ago, I reviewed GameSir Cyclone 2 and went over all the features of this gamepad, which includes TMR thumbsticks, 1000 Hz polling rate, mechanical face buttons, mechanical trigger stops, onboard profile swapping, and keyboard mapping through the GameSir Connect app. In general, I'm a big fan of GameSir. I think they make very good controllers, particularly in terms of value for money, and this is absolutely true with the Cyclone 2, which retails for about $50 as a standalone controller or 55 if you purchase it with the smart charging base. That said, I do have one very consistent gripe with GameSir, and this is the two rear button design that they've stuck with on pretty much every iteration of all of their controller lines. This is something that a lot of people complain about, and something I really hope they move away from in the near future, and honestly expected them to change with their most recent controllers, the Tarantula Pro and Cyclone 2, both of which feature advanced mapping options through the new GameSir Connect app, including the ability to map keyboard inputs. Depending on the games you play, keyboard mapping can be a huge bonus, but it's much less useful when you only have two additional inputs to take advantage of the feature. To be fair, the Tarantula Pro does have a ton of extra inputs. They just designed it in such a way that only two of them, the two rear buttons, are legitimately useful, and the rest are these buttons in line with the view and menu buttons, as well as the three top buttons here that absolutely suck in terms of placement. The Cyclone 2 didn't even get that. With only the two rear buttons and no other additional inputs, it's really hard to take advantage of the keyboard mapping. Because of this, I've hesitated to use the Cyclone 2 consistently, regardless of the fact that I think the performance of this gamepad is absolutely amazing. So I decided to fix it. I basically added two additional top buttons, similar to what we have on the BigBig Won Blitz 2 or the Razer Wolverine V3, and mapped them to D-pad inputs, which can be reassigned to literally anything in the Connect app. I recorded the majority of this process kind of just in case it worked out as well as I hoped it would, and since it did, I'm going to share that process in this video. This isn't exactly a step-by-step guide, it's more of an overview, but I will discuss all of the steps I took, even those that I didn't actually get on camera. Obviously, the first thing I had to do was disassemble the controller, which is basically the same process for every GameSir controller I've owned. We have 7 screws on the back, which are hex screws. There are 2 at the bottom of the grips, 2 at the middle, and 2 at the top inside of the grips, as well as 1 additional screw under the sticker in the center of the back. It's fairly easy to remove this type of sticker without damaging it if you want to put it back on using a heat gun or a hair dryer and taking your time, but I didn't do that with this controller because I didn't really care, and obviously I'm doing other things in this process that will 1000% void my warranty, so that sticker not being there just isn't going to matter. Once the screws are out, you can use a plastic pry tool to pop the faceplate off. I should note that as with every GameSir controller I've disassembled, you will want to take the faceplate off face down, as that's the way these are put together, so if you pull the faceplate off from the front, the buttons are going to fall everywhere. Next, we're going to remove these 2 Phillips screws that hold the home button assembly, which in turn holds the bumper assembly in place, and this bumper assembly is where we're going to actually install our physical buttons. Then we have 4 more Phillips screws on the top PCB board, and then before we can remove the PCB boards, we have to take out the RGB lighting components. This is pretty simple, though it might feel a little questionable or scary at first, but the clear flexible plastic bits just pull out, and then there are 2 more Phillips screws under each of those housings that these were slotted into. Once those are out, these rails are free. The top PCB board plugs into the bottom one so it can just be pulled off. Then there's 1 more Phillips screw in the center holding the larger PCB board in place. Now the main board is free to come out, and when I pulled the board out, I also went ahead and disconnected the rumble motors, which fortunately have plugs, so they're super easy to disconnect and get out of the way. My apologies for the lighting in this portion of the video, but it was unfortunately necessary for the soldering section, which we're getting to here. I used these 4-pin momentary tactile switches for this mod, which I bought on Amazon some time ago, and you can get a bunch of these in various sizes for a few bucks. I started by cutting and stripping 4 sections of high gauge wire. I honestly don't know what gauge this is, it's just the smallest I had on hand. I then wrapped 2 sections of wire around opposite corner posts on the switches and soldered them into place. These are 4-pin switches, but we're only using 2 here, and of course you can pull out a tester to verify which pins are which, but as long as you're using opposite corners on each side of the switches, you should always be okay. I then used hot glue to attach the switches to the bumper assembly, where I drilled holes just large enough for the buttons on the switches to fit through with caps on them. I bought the button caps on Amazon as well, and I'll leave a link to those items or similar ones in the video description. I didn't record drilling the holes for these switches because I did that in my garage rather than in my office, but I essentially just measured where I wanted them based on my finger placement on the controller, and then used an appropriate size drill bit. I used a good bit of glue, and I expect this will hold up for quite a while. This is the fun part, though honestly it was pretty simple on this controller. If you do this or any other modification to any controller, make sure you disconnect the battery if it's a wireless controller. What I'm doing here is soldering the wires to the back of the existing pins for the D-pad switches. These 2 here are the D-pad up switch. I'm wrapping the wire around the existing pins and then just making small solder joints to attach them to the pins. I primarily did D-pad inputs because those are existing inputs on the gamepad that aren't convenient to use in-game without taking your thumbs off of the joysticks, so converting those to usable inputs on top near the triggers adds extra versatility to the controller. But it's also really convenient that the D-pad switches on the Cyclone 2 are easily accessible like this. It makes for a really simple modification. I then did exactly the same thing for the other button using these two pins here, which are for the D-pad left switch. And that's pretty much it other than reassembly. I reinstalled the boards and connected the rumble motors, but then I decided to connect the controller and pull up Gamepad Tester to make sure these buttons were registering before I reinstalled the RGB strips and buttoned it up. If you do fully disassemble the Cyclone 2 or the Collide Flux, which is built pretty much exactly the same, just know that the RGB lighting components are kind of annoying, but ultimately not a big deal to put back together. You just need to get the bottom piece pushed all the way back into the black housing at the bottom so it's against the actual light, and you can test it before you close it up to make sure everything looks correct. And then once fully assembled, I tested it again to make sure my additional buttons were working, as well as everything else. Fortunately, I had no issues with reassembly, and so far I've had no issues since, and man did this elevate the Cyclone 2 for me. I'm not specifically recommending anyone else do this mod. Obviously something could go wrong and you could damage your controller, but for me I basically wasn't getting any use out of the Cyclone 2 anyway because of the lack of additional inputs, so this has really changed it for me and has firmly put this gamepad in the top tier. Bonus content time. I pretty much can't use a controller without trigger stops, so if I buy a controller without them, but I like it enough to use it, I typically add my own. I hadn't done that with my Iron Man G7HE yet because I was just reluctant to modify it, but while I had out this box of micro switches, I decided to try using a couple of those to make internal trigger stops that wouldn't affect the cosmetics of the controller. Disassembly is pretty simple. The magnetic faceplate pops off, and then there are 6 hex screws. They're just on the front under the faceplate rather than on the back. With those out, you can use a pry tool to remove the front of the housing, and just like with the Cyclone 2, you'll want to remove it facing down to avoid losing all the buttons. These rumble motors also have plugs, so I disconnected them and removed them to get them out of the way. The shoulder button assembly lifts out, and then we have 7 hex screws to remove. Then the top PCB board can be removed, but it is connected by a cable rather than a plug on the G7, so be careful of that. You can also just slide both boards out together. There's nothing else holding the bottom board in place. So these are our triggers, and essentially what I want to do is attach one of these tactile switches so that it limits the range of the trigger, and then when you pull the trigger it activates the switch, which is hooked up to absolutely nothing, but we just want that audible click to indicate the trigger's been activated. I used tape to hold them in place first while testing to make sure I was using the most appropriate size switch. I also verified that this was working correctly in Gamepad Tester before going any further. This wouldn't work on some gamepads, but since the G7 controllers have a hair trigger mode in the GameSir app, limiting their movement won't affect anything, at least not in games that I play. If you play racing games or something, I would not advise to do this. Once I was satisfied with the positioning of the switch, I took it back off, removed the tape, and used hot glue to attach it more firmly. One of the best things about adding stops this way is that it's 100% reversible. It's hot glue, it can be removed, and it doesn't involve modifying the case like some of my prior trigger stop mods. As far as the results, I'm pretty happy with it. This was very briefly my favorite trigger stop mod I'd ever done myself or seen anywhere, but obviously these tactile switches aren't the same as micro switches or mouse click switches like I have in my new and improved Cyclone 2. Which made me wonder, should I try to do the same thing with micro switches like this instead of these momentary tactile switches? So I decided to test it out on yet another gamepad that I love, but would love even more with a modification here or there, and that's the Beitong Zeus 2. And this is now for sure the best trigger stop mod I've ever done. These feel and sound as good as any trigger stops on any controller I own. They have as short of a pull as any trigger stops I've tried, and the way they're positioned doesn't interfere with activating the physical trigger stops that the controller has built in, which don't function as stops anymore, but they do activate the hair trigger mode in the software, meaning I now have mouse click trigger stops on my Zeus 2, and they register as a full pull. This video was meant to be all about the Cyclone 2. The entire reason I decided to do a mod video at all was because I felt really cheated by what I consider to be a major problem with an otherwise amazing gamepad. But I kind of fell down the rabbit hole with the trigger stop mod stuff, and I'm really glad I did. For my purposes, the Cyclone 2 is now vastly improved, and a top tier PC controller for me at least. The G7HE is probably my go-to Xbox controller at this point, though admittedly that's partially due to a lack of better options, but at least one of the features it's not missing now is trigger stops. And the Zeus 2 is just a massively underrated PC controller, which is now noticeably better in my eyes with a pretty simple modification. So I'm genuinely curious how you guys feel about this type of video. I'm happy with the results as far as how it affects my controller collection, but hope you guys can let me know if you're interested in more of this type of content in the future or not. Not gonna lie, I've been strongly considering getting some TMR replacement thumbsticks for the Zeus 2 over the last couple of days, because man, that controller could be a monster with one more project. I hope this video helped you out, and if so, please subscribe if you haven't already. Likes are also appreciated, and I do try to react and respond to as many comments as possible. I'll certainly be doing more reviews regularly and possibly more of this type of content, so I hope to see you back here again soon. Thanks for watching.